On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Hello, this is Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, and this is The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. On April 23rd, I spoke with Lewis and Clark law professor David Schraub. Our conversation is somehow far more relevant even a month later, now that the Trump administration is attempting to block Harvard University, that little-known school near Boston, from accepting international students generally, which would include Canadian ones and Israeli ones. Why does Trump want to do this? In part, his administration is saying to protect Jews. Is that really what's going to fight anti-Semitism, preventing Harvard from having international students? I have my doubts, and for further analysis of this topic more generally, we're going to swing back to that conversation with David Schraub.
The Trump backlash is people are saying, oh, it's these invented issues of anti-Semitism. No, they're real issues of anti-Semitism. What's invented is the idea that the Trump administration is interested in responding to them. I don't think the Trump administration's response to it is anything other than a fig leaf for its attempt to crack down on the university writ large.
Hi, this is Phoebe Maltz-Bovey. You're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. So here in Canada, the fight against anti-Semitism is something that Jews are engaged in, at least many of us, with a handful of philo-Semitic allies. But there is not, at least as of April 24th, when we're recording this, any sort of top-down movement to purge anti-Semitism specifically. So a sense that maybe not enough is happening from higher up has led some Jews in Canada to shift rightward in their politics, which in the Canadian context means rather than voting NDP or Liberal voting Conservative, or just preferring sort of the platform of that party once the voting itself is done, and that is not the immediate issue. But if you're a Canadian Jew, you might be accustomed to speaking out against what you see as governmental inaction where anti-Semitism is concerned. But then what happens, and because I'm American and I'm also Canadian, but because I'm looking at this kind of from both sides a little bit, my dual loyalties here, I look at what's happening in the United States, and there's this jarring example of what can happen when a government takes action against anti-Semitism in full force. So here to talk about this with us today is David Schraub, an associate professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, and an expert in, among other areas, anti-Semitism in the law. He's also a commentator and a writer whose work has appeared in Haaretz and other outlets, but also somebody I've known through blogging for actual, honest-to-goodness, decades. Yes, we are that old, and he is still blogging at the debate link, and we will have a link to this and other things David Schraub related in the show notes, but it was a Blue Sky post of David's that prompted me to invite him onto this episode. So first of all, David, welcome to The Jewish Angle.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me. It has been a long time. I am alarmed at now thinking back at how long we have been running in the same blogging circles. Although I think this is the first time that we've interacted even virtually face to face.
Really? I think I once interviewed you for a different publication, but maybe not with video. That's possible.
Maybe. It has been a long time, and I'm old and my memory's going. So.
Fair enough. I mean, I noticed that we both have been blogging since 2004, which, so if you're reading this and you were born, in 2005, don't tell us, we will feel too old. Yeah. So could I read what the post is, though, of yours that I thought it was very astute, but also just like a point I had not seen made elsewhere. And interesting for our purposes here. So you wrote, one aspect of Trump's anti-Semitism fig leaf I haven't seen discussed. If you're a Jewish student who does experience anti-Semitism but doesn't want to blow up your college or get your classmates deported, you basically have no choice but to stay quiet and suffer in silence. Trump did that. Okay, so do you want to explain a little what you sort of unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, I think there's been, and this is even predates the current Trump administration, alarming trend of people who hold themselves out as allies of Jews or Jewish students. They're presenting themselves as standing in solidarity, but are really kind of making it almost impossible to be Jewish on campus. And I first started thinking about this with respect to the University of California, Los Angeles, and an open letter that Jewish students, and it was the Killa leaders, it was people very much embedded in the mainstream of Jewish culture there, wrote to kind of, they said it was like a letter to Jews off campus, or not, or other people off campus, and basically what it boiled down to is like, just stop trying to help us, stop trying to support us, don't come here, don't march here, don't do any of these things, you're making things worse. And I thought it was very powerful, except it wasn't powerful at all because nobody listened to them, right? And the people who claimed to be supporting the Jews, right, didn't care that they were making the lives of Jewish students worse. They didn't care that they were discrediting them on campus. They didn't care that they were isolating them from people who they still had relationships with. They still wanted to preserve relationships with. They were trying to work things out. It was about their own agenda. And you look at various colleges where, I remember at Berkeley, there was some anti-Semitism controversies there, and a kind of a right-wing group pulled up a billboard truck with a big picture of Hitler. Like, oh, well, now the Jewish students, I'm sure, feel a lot better, right? That they have to stare at Hitler outside their window every day while they walk to class. But it puts them in an impossible position, because for the non-Jewish students, they see that as, oh, this is what it means when people say they're fighting anti-Semitism. It means Hitler billboard trucks. It means, kind of rabble-rousers threatening our budget, right? And so anytime a Jewish student tries to raise an issue, even not in that context, there's that immediate worry, oh, this is going to lead us to some very bad, very dark places. And the Jewish students who know, honestly, that these outside groups really don't care about them, don't care what they think, right, are left at a loss, and they end up feeling very, very isolated. And that's something that I've heard, from Jewish students in Portland, and ones around the country as well. And I think it's a really, it's a dangerous phenomenon, but it's just also a really depressing phenomenon, which really is kind of the nutshell characterization of all of 2025 when you think about it.
Fair enough. But I was wondering how much of this just has to do with like the sort of political sort of weirdness of it all, where Jews, for the most part, vote Democrat, but fighting anti-Semitism has become this right-wing coded activity. Mm-hmm. So is that some of it for the students as well?
I think there's something to that, and it's always a bit complicated, because I think it's not fair, and I think it's incorrect to say that liberals have not fought anti-Semitism, have not prioritized fighting anti-Semitism. The Biden administration's national strategy for combating anti-Semitism, I think, was a really important step. And so I think this idea, that it's only Republicans, even if we granted that they're doing it in good faith, which I don't know if that's a concession we should make, is a little is maybe a little too much of a concession.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't mean, to be clear, I don't mean that I think that only right-wingers fight anti-Semitism. I mean, like, if you put in your, like, put it just very simply, if you have in your bio on, like, Instagram, so let's not say X versus Blue Sky, but just something that's, like, politically, it could go either way, and you put, like, fighting anti-Semitism, what would you assume is that person's politics?
Right. And that's very old, right? I don't know if you ever read, it's a old anthology from the 80s, Nice Jewish Girls. But there is
should. I'm a nice Jewish girl from the 80s. I should.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're a radical lesbian nice Jewish girl, which is what the anthology is a collection of. But
yeah.
But it's a very interesting book. And one of the things they talk about in that book, and again, this is from the 80s, and talking about, how one kind of views yourself as a Jew, is like have you silenced yourself talking about anti-Semitism because you think it's right-wing coded, right? That you assume people will think you're conservative when you talk about anti-Semitism. So this has been going on for a very, very long time. And there's this deep mismatch, certainly in the United States, where I think the kind of partisan divide is much broader than it is in almost any other country, where you have a Jewish community that is, broadly speaking, left of center, and a kind of more public understanding of Jews that really views them as much more conservative than they are.
That's
And
interesting. Just to compare with Canada, though, my sense is that fighting anti-Semitism is probably more right-coded in Canada than in the U.S., or was until about 5 minutes ago with all of this. Just,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's been efforts, obviously, to talk about, the importance of fighting anti-Semitism. It's almost bizarre to have to say this, but on the far right, the people who shoot up synagogues, and like that has to be a priority, and recognizing that that is a serious danger to the Jewish community. And I remember, it's amazing how difficult it is to get that thought to penetrate. And I remember Barry Weiss wrote her book. I think it was How to Fight Anti-Semitism. Was that the title?
Yes, I reviewed it. Yes, I remember this one.
And she talked about, like, why am I focusing so much on left-wing anti-Semitism? And the claim is that it's more insidious than right-wing anti-Semitism. The idea being that everybody knows that shooting up a synagogue is wrong, but left-wing anti-Semitism is more subtle, is harder to spot, and so we need to devote more attention to it. And if there's one thing that I've really come to believe over the past couple of years, is that the most insidious form of anti-Semitism, the one that's really hard to spot, that just doesn't get put on the public radar screen, is mainstream right-wing anti-Semitism, right?
Oh.
That's the one that nobody talks about. We'll talk about, somebody shooting up a synagogue, and we will talk till we're blue in the face about, whatever somebody from the Squad, or left-wing Democratic activists say about Israel, right? But when it comes to just the kind of mainstream Republican Party conspiracy monger about George Soros and globalists and replacement theory, that is really difficult to put on the radar screen, and gets less attention than almost anything else.
I wonder why that would be. But I was going to say, so just back to just one more thing about your post. When you write about, like, if a student does experience, a Jewish student who does experience anti-Semitism, I want to sort of drill down on that word experience. So a lot seems to be happening to do with the question of the experience of anti-Semitism. When you talk about that, do you mean something that would necessarily meet an objective standard, or could it be like a feeling?
Yeah, I mean, we have, as I'm sure you know, very much struggled to come up with an objective standard of what is not anti-Semitism, right? And I don't want to say that quest is futile, but one reason that it's important to talk about experiences isn't that, I think this is sometimes said in a bit of a cavalier fashion, oh, if a Jew says they've experienced anti-Semitism, you have to believe them, and it's sometimes said that's something that other minority groups get. I don't think any minority group actually gets that treatment, and I don't think that's feasible. What I do think is feasible is the idea that we should take that sensation, that claimed experience, seriously. It should at least be a starting point of conversation. It doesn't mean we automatically defer to it. It doesn't mean that stops the conversation. We just say, oh, you had this experience. We're done here. We know everything we need to know. But we should assume it's coming from a real place and a genuine place. And it's not, some kind of opportunistic way of trying to, win a political game or hurt, an opposition figure. And again, that's something that's very much under threat, in particular right now, where just raising the issue of anti-Semitism in a very concrete way threatens to unleash some serious forces of political repression, right? And so we don't have that space to do what we should be doing, which is start conversations, start to think about things. We're racing towards a conclusion, and often a conclusion that is either not fully warranted or is, in some cases, just grotesquely disproportionate. And it's kind of skipping over the work that we should be doing. And I think a lot of Jewish students recognize that.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
So what level of culpability, if any, do you think Jewish students who felt sort of microaggressed, to use a term that I know you have actually written about, like published on academically, so that's why I want to ask you about this, a Jewish student who felt microaggressed by the encampments or who wanted a safe space, is it somehow on them that Trump is doing what he's doing?
I don't think that's mostly fair. I mean, we can talk about individual circumstances.
And to be clear, I do not think, because I have seen this argued. And
yeah. And look, there's a difference between somebody who goes up on stage at the RNC, right, and is directly trying to appeal to and claim the legitimacy of this sort of response. And I think that sort of culpability is a different situation. But otherwise, no, I think what we're seeing is a hijacking, right? And I think that, well, I understand why these students, in the context of mass deportations and budget slashing and all of that, aren't being seen as the primary victims. They're being victimized too, right? They're being silenced, and they're being doubly silenced. They're experiencing the anti-Semitism, and often a very real form of anti-Semitism. But they're also being deprived of what the resources that they want to be able to work through it.
I mean, yeah, I definitely, like, I'm thinking specifically of some stuff that Sam Adler-Bell has written about this, where, like, I think he's right in the sense that, like, I don't think that Jews are the main victims when a non-Jew is deported. That doesn't add up, obviously. But, like, yeah, what you're saying about these different level of effects is there too. But I also wanted to ask so I'm just thinking about, like, the encampments and all of this, whether the complexity of the situation with different marginalized groups in conflict with each other, this was something different, right, than, like, previous social justice requests on college campuses, where it was like, okay, this is a group that everybody who thinks about these things agrees is marginalized. There can be discussions about which accommodations are appropriate, but, like, there's not this debate about, do they even count, right? Which seemed to be happening here. So I'm just wondering whether the way all of this has played out has changed how you see the role of the university, whether in making official statements about issues in the news, or in fact in, promises to students of a safe environment.
Yeah. It hasn't changed that much. In some ways, it's retrenched some things that I already kind of felt, and I feel more strongly. A concept that's been taking out of the chin recently has been this idea of institutional neutrality, but I think there's a lot to it. And I've always kind of there's a lot of independent locuses of power and of speech at a university. So I've said I never quite understood why it was so important that my dean or that my university president issue a statement on October 7th. I never expected them to do it, honestly, right? But it's not like that was the only way that it could happen, that I could feel supported. And I never fully understood why it was so essential that they be the ones to stand out. And I think that it was perfectly capable of disaggregating and distributing some of these networks of support away from the institution itself and into your peers and into your colleagues. And I think that remains the case, rather than putting university leadership in, frankly, an impossible situation.
Right. So the statement thing, I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of are like, okay, then maybe just, like, not do the pronouncements. It's a kind of simple fix. But this sort of safe spaces aspect seems a little more complicated, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a term that sometimes casts more heat than light. Because, I mean, when people talk about a safe space, what are they actually talking about, right? And again, oftentimes what we're talking about are the sort of more distributed elements of university life. A Hillel, for example, is setting up certain rules and policies that's designed to make it into, we're not going to be spending all of our time every second of every day debating should Israel exist, right? And you can retreat
and
back
which is
into
why
this.
Hillels are sometimes not so popular
Yeah,
these
it
days.
is. And I think that's a problem. We can debate about whether Hillel is drawing the lines correctly. And I think that's an important conversation. And I think the answer is often no. And what I really wish is that Hillel would be more democratic in making those decision makings rather than kind of being brought down from up on high. But the basic idea, which is that, not every moment of every day needs to be about rehashing this issue, has to sit hand in hand. The reason why that's important, the reason why those places of retreat and respite are important, is because in other places in the university, you are expected to have to encounter these difficult and tough ideas, right? The whole university could never be a safe space, right? That doesn't work, and I don't think that's something that anybody serious claims it can be, right?
Well, I think there had been in the 2010s this kind of idealistic hope that it would be for other marginalized groups. And I don't say this as in like in the kind of every other group got this, why not Jews? But I don't think it's that every other group got this by any means. But I think there was a kind of, it was okay to demand it. And you wouldn't be seen as out of your mind for demanding it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to where that demand was made on this more holistic level, the whole university should just be free of this. It wasn't feasible. Right. It wasn't feasible, and it never came to be because it couldn't have come to be.
I mean, I think that what happened here is what I think that specifically this situation where there are different marginalized groups with conflicting goals sort of showed the flaws in it and why it couldn't perhaps.
Yeah, that's definitely one reason why it couldn't come to pass. But I think one thing that you're getting at is the idea that some members, particularly when we're talking about, 18 to 22-year-olds who are kind of just starting out on this sort of journey and learning some of these contexts, are sometimes going to make unfeasible demands that, when you actually kind of work your way through it, aren't can't be put into practice. There's nothing abnormal about that.
Well, there's nothing abnormal about it. I mean, I think there have been arguments to the effect of like that the 2010s, sort of long 2010s going up to about 2023, was this moment of really idealizing youth and saying like, we need to learn from the young people. They have the, moral certainty. They know what they're doing. We need to defer to them. And now we're seeing a backlash to that that's, I would argue, and I suspect you would as well, worse than the original thing. But like, I do think that, like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think I hallucinated the 2010s.
Well, we were more plausibly the youth of that period, right?
Were we? No, but I think I was like, no, not millennials. Wasn't it Gen Z? Or I guess I'm getting my years wrong. But one thing I wanted to ask you though is, so do you think campuses, we'll just stick with the U.S. for now, since that's the example you're coming from, were insufficiently attentive to anti-Semitism during the encampment protests? As in, do you see this as that Trump is doing overreach, or is the whole thing of just like basically destroying higher ed out of the hopes of returning the U.S. to some kind of manufacturing and trad wife nation?
Yeah. So
and then using Jews as a pretext.
A couple of elements there. One very important one, campuses are a they and not an it, right? I don't know if we can make some overarching claim about what campuses writ large were doing, and how do we assess Columbia versus Carleton College versus Lewis and Clark, right? They're all dealing with this in different ways and with different degrees of success and dealing with different challenges. And I don't think there is some universal answer of, were they handling this correctly?
Well, how about what if we speak about the ones that are so much in the news, right? Like, so Columbia or Harvard, these ones.
Yeah.
Which is still a they and not an it, but
it is still, I have more sympathy than one might expect for university leadership at those schools, who I think were put in some close to impossible situations, right? And some of the way I sometimes describe it is they were dealt a bad hand and they played it poorly, right? I think that Columbia was in a very difficult spot. I think one thing we learned was that sending in a SWAT team to, just cracks protesters' skulls doesn't work, right? It didn't work. And that's what made this whole thing go from just being at Columbia to being a national phenomenon.
And
So,
beyond
it's
national.
international
Yeah.
phenomenon,
Yeah.
right? And so I think there's a lesson there for the people who are just like, oh, well, if university, administrators just stop being babies and, crack down on these malcontents, we wouldn't have this problem. Sometimes the crackdown leads to a bigger backlash. And I think there were some people on the inside who recognize that risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do think, it's a long-standing issue that Jews haven't always been fully incorporated into these discussions about how do we create kind of a diverse and inclusive campus environment. And there's a sort of assumption that they're already on the in, and so they don't need
I
anything
think it's
more.
it's more than a sort of assumption. I think this is, I, I
Well,
don't think,
again,
yeah,
I don't want to overdraw with too broad of a brush.
yeah.
The head of our kind of DEI office at Lewis and Clark at the time, who at the time anyway, she's since moved to a different position. I thought was very well attuned to this.
Mm-hmm.
And really did have a good her finger on the pulse in a way that I thought was very, very helpful. But there's a lot of situations where that isn't the case. Sometimes it's because, people only have so much expertise, right? And it makes sense that it might be focused on other areas. Where I think that turns into a problem isn't where the expertise is lacking. It's where the expertise is lacking and people assume that they already know what they need to know. It's a Dunning-Kruger problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you do have certain situations where people not only don't know that much about Jews, but think they know everything there is to know about Jews. And then you get into, then you start seeing some really kind of toxic responses. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's very real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I do think that there were, issues of anti-Semitism that were really kind of working their way through the campus body like a kidney stone. And so I think though that the pain was not something that was invented or made up. And I think that is something that is often mistaken in the conversations now that we're seeing. The Trump backlash is people are saying, oh, it's these invented issues of anti-Semitism. No, they're real issues of
Mm-hmm.
anti-Semitism. What's invented is the idea that the Trump administration is interested in responding to them. And that's
Yeah.
where the last thing you said is that even though I think some of the anti-Semitism issues are very real, I don't think the Trump administration's response to it is anything other than a fig leaf for its attempt to crack down on the university writ large. And we see that because where anti-Semitism for whatever reason isn't available to them as a talking point on a given campus, they just switch to something else, right?
Mm-hmm.
The consistent point is the crackdown, and the justification comes and goes.
I have only one more question for you,
Mhm.
but because it's just I keep thinking about this clip and I keep watching it. So it's where Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL went on CNN with Dana Bash, and she asked him, what is the ADL doing to pressure the White House to give students who are being arrested due process? So that's her question. And he answered, the answer begins, at the ADL, it's our job to protect the Jewish people. So this made the rounds with a lot of people saying, like, unimpressed with his remark about these being Hamasniks, which I share the not impressed about that part of it. But I'm wondering if there is any sense in which, like in a sort of small sense, perhaps, or maybe not so small, this is kind of true that like I, as an opinion writer, as a whatever pundit, whatever I am, like I speak out about what Trump's doing and the due process aspect of this. But is every group is different. Like I wouldn't say that the main goal of a group trying to free Palestine is like I think it should put a check on anti-Semitism in its ranks, but like I don't think it is an anti-Semitism fighting organization. Like what is the ADL's role, or like just generally like how much does the organized movement to fight anti-Semitism now need to basically just pivot to renouncing, to basically saying what Trump is doing is not in our name and saying that on loop?
Yeah. So on the one hand, the ADL is is sort of the wrong organization to be making this point, because it's always viewed itself and presented itself and acted as if it had a broader ambit, that it's not just an anti-Semitism organization. But I think
I had wondered about that.
Yeah,
too,
no,
yes.
I think that's been a very consistent part of its identity for many, many years, and a subject of some conservative critics who are like, oh, it should only be talking about anti-Semitism. Why does it do these other things? And I think the now kind of wobbliness on that is kind of symptomatic of a broader disarray that has occurred under Jonathan Greenblatt's recent leadership, where the ADL is just it really seems to be floundering, honestly, and that's a very problematic element for the Jewish community that it plays a large role historically in protecting. The broader way of answering the question is, I think if you're an anti-Semitism organization, right, it is always in your bailiwick when people are talking about anti-Semitism wrong, right? I would agree, if at least arguably, if you only focus on anti-Semitism and people were being, deported, over, their LGBTQ advocacy, right? You might say, not that you support it, it's just like that's a different organization's job. We're focusing on this, you focus on that, right? But when it's being done, when again, this is what is being defined in the public eye as what it means to fight anti-Semitism, then you do have an obligation to challenge that. And it's a moral obligation, but it should be a self-serving kind of obligation too, because it threatens your identity also. It threatens your job too. And this is a mistake I think that several analogous organizations have made, where they've really end up ceding too much power to largely non-Jewish institutions and actors, always thinking, oh, well, these are allies, these are useful sources of support, but if they ever go too far, we can kind of rope them back into line. And then they discover, they'll always recognize us as the leaders. And then they discover that actually they don't really care what you think. And I think if the ADL did try to say no to the Trump administration, no, this is too far, this is going too far, what they would discover is the Trump administration doesn't care, right? They're impotent, that the opinions of Jews are utterly irrelevant to the Trump administration's purported fight against anti-Semitism. They are a speed bump at best, right? And this whole idea is that they love to fight on behalf of Jews in quotes, right? This idea of Jews they have in their mind. They don't really like Jews that much, right? And they find Jews kind of inconvenient and very annoying and obnoxiously progressive. And they would be delighted if they could just be left in peace to fight anti-Semitism without having to deal with these pesky Jews telling them no, right?
That was fantastic. I think that should be where we leave it, because what else can be said? But David Schraub, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you?
I'm on Blue Sky, just at Schraub D, bsky.social or whatever the tags are there. And
we can just put this in the show notes. Yeah.
And then the debate link is the long-standing blog that is still on Blogspot, because I am really, 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 really old school.
I like the retro of that. Well, thank you so much for coming on The Jewish Angle.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Mark Weisblatt is the editorial director of the CJN. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.